Hello, I'm Suzanne James for Green Left. Thank you for joining us. While Australia continues to grapple with the biggest housing crisis since World War II, debate rages as to the best way to resolve it. Some believe increased supply at all costs will solve the problem. Others believe all that will do is simply put prices up more and provide more negative geared properties to the rich. It's a very complex issue with a number of facets. We're going to start today by talking to Sue Bolton. She's a fourth-term Merri-bek councillor from Melbourne, and she joins us now from Victoria. Sue, welcome.
Hi, how's it going?
Good, thank you. Now, I'd like to start by talking about the destruction of existing public housing. We're seeing a lot of that in New South Wales. They continue to evict public housing tenants and sell off quite livable public housing properties, both standalone and high density towers, in order to sell often to developers. To what extent is that happening in Victoria? And when it does occur, what are the justifications you're hearing?
Well, this is happening on a massive scale in Victoria, but it's also happening on a massive scale all over Australia. The thing that we're fighting at the moment in Victoria is plans by the state government to demolish every single one of the 44 high-rise public housing estates. This is scandalous. Thousands of people will be shifted out of these towers if they get a chance to implement this plan, and they will not build public housing in return. They will hand it over to private developers on a ground lease model, which means that the developers will have access to government land for 30 to 50 years. It'll still be a government title, but for all intents and purposes, it's been privatised, really. And the vast majority of what they'll build after they knock down these towers will be private apartments, plus some community housing. And community housing is not as good as public housing. It's how the British government privatised their what they called council housing, the same as our public housing. That's how they privatised it in Britain, and that's what they're doing here. And the argument that governments are using to demolish these public housing towers is, oh, they're old, they're past their use by date, blah, blah, blah. But they have not been prepared, the government has not been prepared to reveal any information about the structural soundness of the buildings. And we suspect that that is because the buildings are structurally sound. And in France, where there must have been some similar issues, where the community must have fought back, there is a group of French architects who are refurbishing public housing towers like ours, and even putting balconies on the outside so that tenants, like happens in private apartment blocks, move out while the apartment is being renovated and then move back as soon as it's finished being renovated. And so you don't knock down an entire apartment block, or high-rise public housing estate. And it means you keep the communities together by renovating these buildings.
We'll talk some more about the alleged percentages of built-in community housing shortly, but I'd just like to touch briefly on the YIMBY movement. Now, they believe that getting rid of height restrictions and a lot of the development restrictions, and just allowing high density at all costs is a large part of solving the problem. A lot of people believe that all that's going to do is make it worse unless there's corresponding tax reform. How critical do you think it is to address negative gearing and capital gains tax for the housing crisis?
Well, I think those are things that absolutely definitely need to be addressed. The capital gains tax, that definitely needs to be lifted back to what it was before they started cutting it. And negative gearing, I notice some organisations have now got positions of saying no one, should have access to negative gearing if they've got any more than one investment property. I think that's the Greens' position. I suspect that's to address the fact that over the years, governments have encouraged better paid workers to buy investment properties. And so I think they must be trying to pitch to those people while trying to say that negative gearing should be cancelled for people who own multiple properties. So I definitely think that's necessary to address those issues of either abolishing negative gearing or doing what the Greens have suggested. But I think at the end of the day, there also need to be other things that are done in addition to those things. And the critical thing is building genuine public housing, but also penalising developers who leave land vacant after like land banking. Because there are a lot of developers who get permits from councils, sit on that land for many years to force the prices up, land prices. And so there's a real manipulation of the market by developers through land banking. And then also there's the issue of developers having apartment blocks where certain units and dwellings are left vacant. And we know that there's something like 10% or more dwellings that are vacant for more than 12 months. And there is an organisation called Prosper who's even carried out a number of surveys to work this out. The way Prosper has worked it out is they work out properties where no utility has been turned on in over 12 months. And that's actually probably a more scientific way of working out the massive number of properties that are left vacant for more than 12 months for whatever reason. And the Victorian government does have a vacant land tax, but and they introduced that with great fanfare. But the problem with that is it requires landlords to self-report that that their dwelling has been vacant for more than a certain period of time. No developer is going to do that. And so very little money has actually been raised. Very few landlords who've left dwellings vacant have actually been taxed. So I think you definitely need to abolish negative gearing and increase capital gains tax, but you need to do more than that. You need to address land banking, and developers also manipulate the other end when state governments expand the urban growth boundary of big cities. Once upon a time, there used to be a public agency that managed the allocation of land after the urban growth boundary was expanded. But now that is all done by private companies, and they trickle out the new land to keep the prices up. So there's nothing that the YIMBY say or the state government says about any of this market manipulation. And in fact, their focus, their entire and federal government it falls into this bracket as well. They don't criticise the property developers for manipulating the market. Instead, they focus all their attention on councils as holding up development through and the building of more housing through red tape. Now, sometimes there can be bureaucratic, unwieldy processes, but some of that so-called red tape is regulation that was won by communities over many community campaigns over years to either protect green space, green wedges in cities, fight for amenity, fight for safer building standards. Some of that so-called red tape is all of those sorts of things. And so it's sort of interesting that state and federal governments and developers and the YIMBYs are focusing their attention on local councils, but there are thousands of planning permits out there in local council areas across Melbourne, but the developers haven't built on those permits because they're waiting to drive up the costs of housing and land.
We'll get to talk about the building standards in a bit more detail shortly, but I'd just like to talk about public and community housing allocations. Now, In New South Wales, we keep hearing how certain developments are going to be social and affordable and they're going to have certain percentages. Obviously, the word public has been outlawed by the Minns government. They don't even want to talk about public housing. It's always privately head leased to social housing corporations or Homes New South Wales or whatever. That being the case, when you see these developments come across your desk as a councillor and they're saying in the DA that they're going to quote unquote allocate certain percentages to social and affordable housing, what does that actually mean? And is it a real thing? Are they enforceable or is it just more government window dressing?
Well, I would say the latter, more government window dressing. So they do make a differentiation between affordable and social housing. But usually the social housing they talk about is exclusively community housing. It's never ever public housing. There are various categories of affordable housing, and generally when people use the term affordable housing, I usually immediately think fraudulent use of the term, because it's meant to be for people who are in work who might not be earning sky high amounts of money, and it can be used for housing that's for sale as well as housing that's for rent. So it's targeting people on much better incomes, maybe not super rich incomes, but much better incomes. But really, it isn't enforceable. It's not, I think the experience, I did see one study where it indicated that they don't actually have any kind of enforcement of the affordable and social housing components of development. Often these developments where they do have some affordable or social housing, usually it's only for a limited period of time, might be 15 years. And then it's all just like open slather private housing with no income limits. And sometimes in the past, affordable housing has been used for developers to be able to sell off an inconveniently sized dwelling that they can't build as big as all of the others. It's just the leftover space that they've turned into an extra unit, which they sell off because it's hard to get someone to buy a unit that's not quite so spacious. So I think this is really fraudulent. If any of them are genuine, they're usually not forever. They're usually just affordable or community housing for a set period of time. And then you can have situations where one community housing provider I'm aware of in one development, which was an old state government building, which was turned into an apartment block. So there was a bit more of an expectation of social housing. But the particular housing provider, unbeknownst to a particular tenant I got to know through a community campaign, it was a different kind of model. It was a model where people who had either moved out of their home for a period of a few years or had an investment property, handed those properties over to this community housing provider as long as they didn't, for a particular period of time, and then they would get back their unit back, either for them to live on or rent out to someone else. And so there have been people who've signed leases for these units for social housing, believing they'd be there for a very long time. And then voila, they've been evicted to allow the owner to move back in or rent to family or other people. It's not what people think. The difference with public housing, between public and community housing, is public housing has much stronger leases. There's a lot more protection for tenants. People in public housing pay less rent. They pay 25% of their income in rent. If they don't, then not working full time, whereas in community housing they pay 30% of their income in rent. Community housing cherry picks who goes in, so they prefer to have people who are working full time, or most of the time they prefer to have workers. They house very few people on Centrelink. The people they prefer who might receive Centrelink payments would be pensioners, either aged pensioners or disability pensioners or single parent pensioners, because they get a higher amount through Centrelink. They house very few people on job seeker, and they house zero young people unless the young people are on a disability pension.
It's like so many profit-driven models, isn't it? It's all about the bucks and nothing about the people, and it's just going further in that direction. I'm glad you mentioned the disabled, because I'd like to finish now by talking about building standards. We'll talk first about overall general building standards, and then we'll look at disability standards, such as those that Greens MP Abigail Boyd has been advocating for. So we've seen, in terms of overall building standards on high-density towers, for example, Sydney's Opal Towers and other towers like it have been an absolute disaster for the people who have bought into that development. We've also seen the aluminium cladding review following a dreadful fire in the Grenfell Tower in the UK, and all of those things sort of show that it's so profit driven that safety and basic building standards have been eroded to the point where some of these high density outfits are simply not safe to live in, and they won't be for many years. And people have invested their life savings, and they're now without a home and without any money. So, what's the situation in Victoria in terms of building standards and new developments and high density?
Well, it's similar here, and I suspect all of what you've been talking about through the whole interview is similar throughout Australia. So it's not just for New South Wales, not just Victoria, it's most of Australia. So in Victoria, we had the Kennett coalition government in the 1990s, and around the mid-90s, around 94 or so thereabouts, they amended the Building Act to reduce the number of building inspections. So prior to that, buildings had to be inspected 5 times. One is before the build starts, to make sure the building permit is all okay. Then there'd be 3 times at different phases of the development, and then the 5th time would be after the development's finished. So the Kennett government reformed the Building Act to only allow for 3 inspections. So one would be before the development starts, one would be just after the frame is put up, and one is after the building is finished. Now, usually that last one tends to be a tick the box, check the paperwork. It's often not even necessarily a physical inspection. And they also, through that amendment to the Building Act, they privatised building inspectors. So once upon a time, building inspectors were employed by councils, and council did the building inspections, and council building surveyors issued the building permits. That was all gotten rid of. So, while no doubt there's good building surveyors out there, you can imagine there'll be some developers that would have their friendly building surveyor who would give them a pretty easy run with their developments. And there was one building where there was a cladding fire in Melbourne, the Lacrosse building in Spencer Street, where I heard, now this never came out in the public, but through the body corporate I'm part of, or owners corporation I'm part of, and that my body corporate manager said that discussion with the other body corporates and the body corporate that covered that particular building, the Lacrosse building, was that the building inspector, the building surveyor, who checked off the paperwork at the end of the development, they checked off the paperwork, it was all correctly filled in, but they didn't realise the developer had swapped a flammable form of cladding for the inflammable form of cladding. So, and hence that fire. So you can see the problems that can happen, and I think well, actually probably Victoria went further than all of the other states in terms of deregulating the industry because we had the Kennett government, but it seems that most governments around the country are doing similar things.
I'd like to finish now by talking about disability building standards. Now, Abigail Boyd, Greens MP in New South Wales, has been trying for some time to get the New South Wales government to recognise the benefits of building basic disability access like broader doorways and ramps and so forth into high density, especially from the moment it's on the planning table. We've never been able to get those laws through here. We also have major issues here with trying to get home modifications for anyone who is in public or social housing, and it's turned into a complete nightmare for many. What's the situation for disabled people in Victoria concerning building standards and public housing?
Well, when it comes to building standards, there's very little building that takes into account accessibility in a genuine kind of way. And one of the problems in Victoria is that they make very few things mandatory. Almost everything is discretionary. And so that when I first got elected to council, developers used to focus on environmental sustainability measures, that we've put in this great environmentally sustainable measure, so therefore you need to let us go above the height limit. So you have all this horse trading between developers and local councils. And so then local councils say, well, yes, you can go above the limit because you've got this particular environmental sustainability measure. Then they changed the state planning, amended the state planning laws to allow for accessibility and affordable housing. But of course, none of this is mandatory. It's all discretionary. And I'm sure that is by design because it's a way of moralising against councillors to go above the height limits. And sometimes the height limits have been adopted as a result of extensive public consultation a long time ago. It might not have been perfect, but it's extensive consultation. So if that was to mean anything, they actually need to stick by it and they should make these standards mandatory. Accessibility should be made mandatory, affordable housing, social housing, etc., should be made mandatory, not discretionary. And so, yeah, they've maintained this situation where everything, there's all of this horse trading of, oh, well, we'll let the developer go a little bit further, in height, or a lot further in height, sometimes up to double the height, in return for doing certain things that they should be obliged to do anyway. So none of these things like accessibility shouldn't be a subject of horse trading. And then there's different standards accessibility in private dwellings. And of course, developers go for the least adequate of those standards generally. So for people in public and community housing will not do modifications to dwellings if you acquire a disability. And that possibly means they often might not necessarily have a lot of housing that is actually accessible. Someone who acquires a disability has to pay for it themselves. So we have heard of a scandalous story where a woman had a two-story unit, because a lot of the units are two-story now, like the living areas on the top story with with the bedroom at the bottom or vice versa. So this woman, because she didn't have a bathroom on the bottom story, she had to wash in a bucket because she couldn't get up the stairs, and the community housing wouldn't do any modification. She was on Centrelink, so she couldn't afford to do a modification. Now, public housing is bound by legislation to carry out modifications on behalf of tenants. But no doubt, as the public housing authorities are trying to wind back, or the state governments are trying to wind back and get rid of public housing, no doubt it is very hard to get modifications done, because there's a lot of basic maintenance and rubbish collection that's not being done properly in the public housing estates. And I think that's because governments are trying to demoralise public housing tenants to move out.
Look, as someone who comes from a family who's had disability in the household of all kinds over many years, it makes me absolutely furious the degree to which people are ignorant of which the simplest, cheapest modifications can make life so much easier for someone who's disabled. And I've worked with a number of New South Wales public housing tenants who have asked for quite simple modifications, not only in public homes but also in social housing as well. And the convoluted, semi-privatised, fractured way that the maintenance and disability modifications are done has just made it literally a physical impossibility for them to even navigate the basic systems to get the job on the board. And it's just so disheartening, because it's so obvious as someone who comes from a disability household that they just want to get rid of us. You know, they don't want public and genuinely affordable housing. They don't care about people with a disability not being able to access the basics of their home, whether or not that is an incoming tenant trying to find a property. And I can tell you there is no such thing on the private market, very rarely, as a fully modified property, or whether it comes to the income limits or, you know, any sort of reference to disability in high density towers. I've seen people trapped in units, unable to get out because the lift hasn't been maintained. Everyone else just takes the fire stairs, and it's just all sorts of life-threatening situations. And the more I look at housing and the more articles and videos and interviews I do on it, the less I think the government cares about people with a disability. So I thank you very much, Sue Bolton, for your time today. It's been great to hear your insight and find out what's happening across our southern border with our friends in Victoria. Thanks for joining us.
No, thank you. And the thing is, this is a national issue. It's happening all over Australia.
So thank you, Sue Bolton, for joining us. I'm Suzanne James for Green Left. See you next time.